His fingers brushed her exposed neck, and the whole world seemed to freeze in that forbidden touch. Clara's breath caught in her throat as she felt Kyle's warm exhale against her skin, his teeth so close to her vulnerable flesh that she could feel the phantom pressure of a bite that would never come. A tear slid silently down her face, losing itself in her dark hair spread across the cold stone. The scent of blood and battle saturated the air around them, but there, in that suspended instant between life and death, existed only the unbearable weight of a broken promise and a love that refused to die. Before we dive into this story, leave your comment with a note from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain saturated every corner of the throne room, a fragrance so dense it seemed to have its own weight, capable of crushing the bones of anyone who dared to breathe too deeply. Clara felt her knees tremble against the icy stone floor, the cold seeping through the thin fabric of the worn dress that barely covered her slender body. It was a dress that had once been beautiful years ago, when her mother wore it to some harvest festival, but now the seams were frayed and the colors had faded to an undefined shade of gray. She didn't dare lift her eyes, keeping her neck exposed in an instinctive gesture her mother had taught her before she died. Before an alpha, an omega never looks first, never challenges, never breathes without permission. These were rules etched into her flesh since childhood, as natural as breathing. His presence filled the chamber, like a storm about to break. Clara didn't need to see him to know exactly where he was, seated on that throne of black stone, carved with howling wolves, every detail of the royal chair telling stories of blood and conquest. It was said that the throne stone had been brought from the northern peaks generations ago, torn from the heart of a dormant volcano by the first alphas of the lineage. It was also said that the stone absorbed the power of each king who sat upon it, growing darker with each generation. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic sound of his claws drumming on the armrest of the throne. It was a cruel ticking that echoed through the walls like a sentence being written in the air, each beat seeming to count the seconds remaining of Clara's life as she knew it. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to remember the reason that had brought her there. Her pack was on the brink of ruin, decimated by hunger that had dragged on for 3 consecutive winters, and by northern raiders who had burned their crops and stolen their herds. The granaries were empty, the wells almost dry, and the disease spreading among the weakest had already claimed dozens of lives. Her younger brothers, 3 boys barely 10 years old, were so thin she could count every rib when she hugged them at night. The youngest, Tommy, had stopped asking for food, as if his small body had already given up waiting. Her grandmother, Evelyn, the only adult relative she had left, had been coughing blood for weeks and wouldn't survive the next winter without the remedies only the large packs could offer. She had been sent as a last resort, a living peace, offering to the most feared predator on the continent. Alpha King Kale had governed the Eastern Reach with an iron fist for 15 years, since he ascended the throne at 19 after his father's mysterious death. Rumors about the young king were contradictory and equally terrifying. They said he never smiled, that his lips hadn't known the curve of joy since he was a boy. They said his eyes changed color when rage consumed him, shifting from common amber to an incandescent gold that made even the most experienced warriors recoil. They said he had executed his own uncle with his bare hands when the man tried to usurp the throne during his first full moon as Alpha. They said he'd gone mad like his father, but in a different way. Colder, more calculated, more dangerous. They said many things about Kale, and Clara was about to discover which of them were true. His voice sliced through the silence like a blade through silk. It was a low growl, vibrating at frequencies she felt directly in her bones, making her inner wolf writhe in a confused mixture of fear and something more she refused to name. It was as if every cell of her body was being awakened by that sound, roused from a sleep she hadn't even known she was in. "So it's you," he said, and there was something in the words that sounded almost like disappointment. Or perhaps it was just boredom, the boredom of a predator who had seen too many preys to be impressed by another. "The offering from the Green Valley Hills pack." Clara swallowed hard, but didn't respond. No one had given her permission to speak, and even if she had, what would she say? That she was sorry for being so insignificant, that she apologized for her miserable appearance, for her worn dress, for her dull hair, that she regretted not being what he deserved. She heard the rustle of fabrics, the sound of heavy boots descending the stone steps. Each step reverberated in her chest like a drumbeat, approaching, until his shadow enveloped her completely. It was a cold shadow, despite the heat she could feel emanating from his body, as if he carried his own particular storm wherever he went. He circled her like a wolf, assessing its prey, and she felt his gaze sweep over her slender body, her dull black hair, her hands calloused from working in the fields her entire life. She knew what he was seeing, a poor, malnourished girl, common in every sense, a disappointment. Kyle stopped before her and inhaled deeply. The world seemed to shudder. Clara felt her own body react in ways she didn't understand. An inexplicable warmth spread through her veins, heating her from the inside out, making her heart race until it felt like it would leap from her chest. She realized with a chilling shock that his scent was invading her senses in a way she had never experienced before. Dark spices, tanned leather, something wild that resembled a forest after rain. It was intoxicating. It was terrifying. It was as if every cell of her body was awakening from a deep slumber, recognizing something her mind couldn't yet process. "Look at me," he commanded. His voice admitted no refusal. It was a command in its purest form, charged with the authority of generations of alphas. Clara slowly raised her face, every inch a battle against the instincts that told her to remain submissive, and her eyes met his for the first time. Liquid gold. There was no other way to describe it. Kyle's eyes were like melted sun, hypnotic and dangerous, framed by dark lashes and thick brows that furrowed slightly when their gazes crossed. He was younger than she had imagined, perhaps in his early 30s, with a face of hard lines and a thin scar that cut from his left eyebrow to his temple. A story written in flesh, a reminder of past battles. His hair was black as a raven's wing, long enough to be tied back at the nape of his neck, some loose strands framing his severe face. He was terrifying. He was magnificent. He was everything she had feared, and something more she couldn't name. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them crackled with an almost visible electricity, as if the universe itself was holding its breath before that encounter. Clara felt her inner wolf stir, whimpering softly, recognizing something she couldn't yet name. Fated. The word arose in her mind like an ancestral whisper, coming from a place so deep it seemed to exist before she did. She pushed it away immediately, horrified by the implication. It was madness. It was impossible. A miserable Omega from a failed pack couldn't be fated to the most powerful Alpha King on the continent. Fate wasn't that cruel, or perhaps it was exactly that, cruel in a way only the ancient gods could conceive. Kyle raised his hand and touched her chin with a single calloused finger, tilting her face to study her better. The touch sent shockwaves through Clara's body, an electric current that coursed through every nerve, every vein, every fiber of her being. She saw something flicker in his eyes, a surprise he quickly masked under layers of calculated coolness. But she had seen. For a fraction of a second, she had seen the man behind the king's mask. "You know why you're here," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, Your Majesty." Her voice came out hoarse, scratched by fear and thirst. She hadn't drunk water since morning, when the guards had pulled her from the carriage and shoved her into the castle as if she were mere cargo. My pack offers my hand in marriage in exchange for protection and resources. Your hand. He repeated the words as if they were bitter on his tongue, as if their taste offended him somehow, as if you were a commodity to be traded. Clara didn't respond. That was exactly what she was after all, a coin of flesh and bone, exchanged for the survival of starving children and dying elders. She had come to terms with it during the long journey to the citadel, crying in silence on cold nights as the carriage rattled over bumpy roads. Kyle released her abruptly and stepped back a few paces, turning his back to her. She watched his broad shoulders rise and fall as he took a deep breath, controlling something she couldn't identify. The tension in his body was palpable, as if he were fighting a battle with himself. When he turned again, his face was an impenetrable mask. "I accept the offer," he said, and Clara felt relief flood her chest like a warm wave. Her brothers would be fed. Her grandmother would receive medicine. Her pack would survive the winter. But then Kyle continued, and the relief turned to ice. "But there will be a single condition." Clara raised her eyes again, meeting his gaze. Kyle's expression had hardened even further, if that were possible. All the intensity of that previous moment had been replaced by something cold, calculated, almost cruel. Almost, but not completely. There was something behind the coolness, something she couldn't identify. "You will rule by my side," he said, each word measured and precise as the edge of a sword. "You will sleep in my bed. You will carry my scent to ward off rivals who circle my throne like hungry vultures. To all intents and purposes, you will be my wife, my Luna, my queen." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "But I will never mark you." The silence that followed seemed to have physical weight. "My teeth will never touch the skin of your neck to seal the bond," Kyle continued, his voice devoid of any emotion. "We will be partners in politics, but strangers in soul. You will have everything a queen should have: jewels, clothes, power, public respect. But you will never have the one thing that truly matters to your kind." Shock coursed down Clara's spine like lightning. In their world, a union without the mating mark was an aberration, a biological torture that would leave both in a constant state of unconsummated desire and primal anxiety. Their wolves' instincts would push them towards each other incessantly, while the absence of the complete bond would keep them eternally separated. It was like offering water to someone dying of thirst, but forbidding them to drink. An unmarked Luna was merely a glorified concubine in the eyes of the pack, vulnerable, incomplete, open to challenges from any female who wished to take her place. It was a position of shame, not honor. "Your Majesty," she began to protest, her instincts screaming against that implicit rejection of her own nature. "Those are my terms," Kyle interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. "Accept them, or return to your pack empty-handed. The choice is yours." The image of her brothers flashed in Clara's mind with painful clarity. Their thin faces, eyes too large for such childish features, the desperate hope with which they had said goodbye to her on the road. Tommy, the youngest, clinging to her skirt, crying that he didn't want her to go. Luke and Pete, trying to be strong, pretending they weren't scared. Her grandmother, Evelyn, embracing her one last time, whispering that she was stronger than she thought. She thought of the approaching winter, the empty granaries, the northern wolves who would surely return to finish what they had started. She thought of all her people had lost, and all they still could lose. Swallowing her pride and fear, Clara nodded slowly. "I accept your terms, Your Majesty." Something flickered in Kyle's eyes, so fast she almost didn't notice. Pain, relief, regret. Whatever it was, it vanished before she could identify it, replaced by the icy mask he seemed to wear as armor. He extended his hand toward her. Then it is done. The agreement was sealed not with a bite, as it should be between fated mates, but with a cold, formal handshake. His palm was warm against hers, his long, strong fingers enclosing her small hand with a firmness that sent shivers through Clara's entire body. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, she felt his fingers squeeze hers with something that felt like desperation. Then he released her, and the cold returned. "The ceremony will be in 3 days," Kyle said, already turning back toward the throne. "My maids will prepare you. You will have chambers in the East Wing until the wedding. Speak to no one about the terms of our agreement. To all intents and purposes, we will be a couple like any other." Clara curtsied, her legs trembling so much she could barely stand. "Yes, Your Majesty." He didn't look back as he ascended the steps. He offered no word of comfort, no gesture of kindness. He simply sat on his black stone throne and waved to the guards, dismissing her as if she were less than nothing. As she was escorted out of the throne room, Clara allowed herself a single glance over her shoulder. Kyle was motionless on the throne, his golden eyes fixed on some distant point, his fists clenched on the armrests, with such force that she could see the white of his knuckles even from a distance. He looked like a man fighting against something he couldn't win. She didn't know that that image would haunt her for many nights as she lay alone in a bed too large, in the castle of the man who would be her husband, but never her mate. She didn't know that this cruel condition was just the beginning of a journey that would test every fiber of her being. She didn't know that fate had much bigger plans for both of them, plans written in blood and stars that no condition imposed by fear could prevent. All Clara knew at that moment was that she had just sold her soul to save her people, and the price would be higher than she could ever imagine. The 3 days leading up to the ceremony passed in a blur of silk, perfumes, and sharp glances. Clara was settled in quarters that seemed larger than the entire house she had grown up in the Green Valley Hills, with high windows overlooking the citadel's inner gardens, and a 4-poster bed with crimson velvet canopies that could accommodate an entire family. The furniture was of dark wood, carved with patterns of leaves and wolves, each piece worth more than everything her pack owned combined. The maids assigned to attend her were efficient, but distant. Their skilled hands worked on her hair and skin as if she were a doll to be prepared for display, not a person with feelings or fears. None of them smiled. None of them looked her in the eye for more than a second. It was as if they had received specific instructions to treat her with professional courtesy, but never with warmth. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Brittany, was particularly cold. Clara caught her more than once studying her neck with an expression that bordered on disdain, and it wasn't hard to understand why. In 3 days, she would be crowned queen, but her neck would remain untouched. Everyone would know it was a sham. On the morning of the wedding, Clara woke before dawn, her stomach knotted with nervousness. She dragged herself to the window and watched the sky slowly lighten, shades of pink and orange painting the clouds as the sun began its daily journey. The view was stunning, immaculate. Gardens stretching as far as the eye could see, marble fountains spouting crystal-clear water, stone paths winding among flower beds she didn't recognize. Somewhere beyond those mountains rising on the horizon, her brothers would be waking in their thin beds, perhaps already with enough food, thanks to the first shipment sent by the citadel. She had asked one of the maids 2 days earlier, and received confirmation. The king had sent provisions immediately after the agreement was sealed. Grains, salted meat, medicinal herbs, wool blankets, enough to ensure her pack would survive the winter. Kyle's promise was being kept, at least in that aspect. This should have been comforting, but somehow it only made everything harder to bear. The rest of the day passed in a haze of preparations perfumed baths with jasmine and lavender oils that left her skin softer than it had ever been, hair braided in elaborate patterns, intertwined with silver threads and small white flowers that exuded a sweet perfume, nails polished, eyebrows trimmed, every stray hair removed with almost surgical precision. And then the dress. It was the most beautiful thing Clara had ever seen in her entire life. White silk, so fine it seemed to have been woven by fairies, embroidered with gold threads that shimmered in the candlelight like stars captured in fabric. The bodice fit her torso perfectly, accentuating curves she hadn't even known she had. The skirt spread around her like a cloud, yards and yards of precious fabric that whispered with every movement. When Clara finally saw herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. She looked like a queen, or at least the image others had of a queen. Beautiful, immaculate, perfect, empty. The ceremony took place at sunset, in the citadel's large central courtyard, under a sky tinged with purple and gold. Hundreds of pack members gathered around, curious faces studying the foreign bride who had captured the king's attention. Clara walked down the aisle formed between them, each step measured and deliberate, her eyes fixed on the tall figure waiting for her at the end. She could feel the stares on her, some curious, others hostile, others simply devoid of any emotion. Whispers spread like ripples on a disturbed lake. She's so thin. From the Green Valley Hills, they say, a pack of beggars. Is she really fated to him? Doesn't matter. She'll never be one of us. Clara kept her head held high, pretending not to hear. It was a skill she had learned early, on the streets of her own village, where other children mocked her for being an orphan. Cale was dressed in black, as always, but there was something different about him that night. Perhaps it was the silver crown that gleamed on his brow, intertwined with rubies that shone like drops of blood. Perhaps it was the way the twilight transformed his eyes into pools of molten gold. Or perhaps it was just the tension emanating from every line of his body, the same tension she had felt in the throne room. He watched her approach with an intensity that made her heart stumble in its own rhythm. There was nothing gentle in his gaze, nothing comforting. It was the look of a predator assessing its prey, deciding if she was worthy of the effort. The priestess who conducted the ceremony was an elder woman with completely white hair and milky eyes that seemed to see through reality. Her name was Celeste, and they said she had served the moon for over 80 years since she was marked. As a healer in childhood, she moved with a slow grace, her white robes rustling softly as she took her position between the bride and groom. Celeste recited the ancient words of the union ritual, invoking the blessings of the moon and stars upon the couple. Her voice was surprisingly strong for someone of her age, echoing through the silent courtyard like the tolling of a bell. Before the moon that created us and the stars that guide us, we gather to witness the union of two souls, destined by the thread of fate. May their lives intertwine like the roots of an ancient tree seeking strength in each other. May their love be like the river that flows to the sea, inevitable and eternal. When it was time for the exchange of vows, Celeste's voice faltered almost imperceptibly. Clara realized that even she found the incomplete nature of that union strange. The elder knew the terms, of course. The king had personally informed her, making it clear that the bite would not happen. Kyle held Clara's hand as he repeated the vows, his voice firm and clear, echoing through the silent courtyard. The words were ancient, ritualistic, repeated by generations of mates. I take you as mine, to protect and honor in times of peace and war, in sickness and health, until the moon ceases to shine and the stars fall from the sky. But when she looked into his eyes, She saw something no one else seemed to perceive, an almost imperceptible tremor in his jaw, as if each word was torn from him by force, as if he was fighting against something within himself. When it was Clara's turn to speak, her voice came out stronger than she expected. Perhaps it was the anger hidden beneath layers of acceptance. Perhaps it was wounded pride that refused to appear weak before all those people who judged her. Whatever it was, she pronounced the vows without hesitation, sealing her destiny with words that promised loyalty and devotion, but never mentioned love. The ceremony ended without the ritual bite. A murmur ran through the crowd like a shockwave, whispers of astonishment and thinly veiled scandal. Clara felt the gazes piercing the back of her neck like icy needles as Cale guided her into the castle, his large, warm hand at the base of her spine, possessive even without the mark that should legitimize that possession. The banquet that followed was refined torture. Clara sat beside Cale at the main table, trying to eat something while dozens of eyes dissected her. The food was magnificent, dishes she couldn't even name, succulent meats and vegetables prepared in ways that looked like works of art, but everything tasted like ash in her mouth. The conversations around them were carefully neutral, but she could feel the venomous whispers hidden beneath polished smiles. Every time someone raised a glass in a toast, she saw eyes slide to her bare neck, searching for the mark that wasn't there. That's when she saw her for the first time, Morgana. The woman was seated a few chairs to Kyle's right, her cold green eyes fixed on Clara with a predatory intensity. She was exactly the opposite of the new queen, tall, voluptuous, with fiery red hair that cascaded over her shoulders like a waterfall. Her skin was flawless, her features aristocratic, and she displayed her neck with a confidence that suggested she had never needed to worry about rejection. "The beta favorite," whispered one of the maids serving wine, leaning close to Clara as if merely refilling her glass. Lady Morgana. She expected to be chosen when the king decided to take a wife. Some say she has shared his bed on more than one occasion. I'd be careful, my lady. She won't accept this humiliation without a fight. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. It wasn't jealousy, she told herself. She had no right to feel jealous of a man who had made it clear he would never truly be hers. But when Morgana leaned in to whisper something in the ear of a nobleman beside her, her green eyes never leaving Clara's, it was impossible not to feel the implicit threat in that gaze. The night crept on slowly, each minute dragging like an hour. When guests finally began to disperse and Cale stood, offering Clara his hand, she felt her heart race in a way that had nothing to do with desire. It was pure and simple fear, fear of what would come next. The walk to the royal chambers was silent. The citadel's corridors seemed endless in the torchlight that cast dancing shadows on the stone walls. Guards bowed in deference as they passed, but Clara barely noticed them, all her attention focused on Cale's hand still holding hers, on the warmth radiating from him, on the overwhelming scent that seemed to intensify with each step. When they finally reached the king's chambers, he opened the heavy oak door and ushered her in first. The room was enormous, dominated by a massive bed covered with dark linen sheets. Candles scattered throughout the room cast a soft, golden light, and the scent of sandalwood was stronger there than anywhere else in the castle. Clara stopped in the center of the room, unsure what to do with her hands. Behind her she heard the door close and the latch slide into place. For a long moment, neither of them moved. "You can take off your dress," Kyle finally said, his voice hoarse. "There are sleeping clothes in the wardrobe to the left." He stood by the door, his arms crossed over his chest, keeping as much distance from her as possible within that enclosed space. "Are you going to stand there all night?" she heard herself ask, and immediately regretted the boldness. Something flickered in Cale's eyes, something that looked almost like pain. "I sleep on the right side," he said, ignoring the question. "You can have the left. The bed is large enough that we won't need to touch." When she finally lay down, the mattress was so soft she sank, as if being embraced by clouds. But the physical comfort did little to quell the turmoil in her mind. His scent enveloped her like an invisible blanket, making her inner wolf whimper in an almost painful way. Every instinct screamed for her to move closer, to seek his warmth. Neither of them slept that night. And so began the longest days of Clara's life. During the day, Kyle and she played their roles to perfection. She accompanied him to audiences, sitting on a smaller throne beside him. He introduced her to counselors, always with a possessive hand on her back. But at night, the truth emerged. Kyle moved away to his side of the bed, as if her touch could burn him. Clara curled up in her own space, biting her lips to keep from crying. The wolf inside her was withering, weakening with each passing night, and the whispers at court only grew louder. "The untouched queen," they said in dark corners. "The false Luna." Morgana was the worst of all. She appeared at every event, always with a venomous smile on her lips. "It must be difficult," she said once, approaching during a banquet, "to share a man's bed like him and never truly have him. I know what it's like. Well, not exactly what it's like, since when I was in that bed, he didn't need to hold back." That night, lying in the darkness, Clara finally allowed the tears to fall. Across the bed, Kyle stirred. "I'm sorry," he whispered in the darkness, "for all of this." And before she could reply, he moved away again. She was an incomplete Luna, and she was dying because of it. The fevers began in the 3rd week after the wedding. Low and constant, they haunted Clara's nights, leaving her weak and trembling by dawn. She woke with the sheets drenched in sweat, her body shaking even under mountains of blankets, her mind clouded with confused dreams she could barely remember. The court healers were called regularly, men and women with grave expressions who examined her, took her temperature, checked her pulse, and always left shaking their heads. None could find a physical cause for the illness that consumed her. There was no infection, no wound, none of the typical signs of disease they had learned to recognize. "It's as if her body is giving up," one of them murmured to another, thinking she couldn't hear. "As if something essential is missing." Only the elder priestess seemed to understand. Celeste appeared in her chambers one rainy afternoon, when Clara could barely get out of bed. The old healer sat beside her, her milky eyes studying her with an intensity that seemed to see through flesh to the soul. "You know what's happening, don't you?" Celeste asked, her voice soft as the rustling of dry leaves. "I'm dying," Clara replied, the words escaping before she could hold them back. "My wolf is dying and taking my body with it." Celeste nodded slowly. "The lack of the bond," she said. "Your wolf is withering because of the rejection of its fated mate. This happens when a fated couple refuses to complete the union. It's rare because most fated mates cannot resist the call, but when it happens—" "He doesn't reject me," Clara murmured, though the words sounded hollow even to her own ears. "He simply can't mark me." The priestess studied her with those eyes that seemed to see beyond the flesh. "Can't or won't, there's a difference, child." Clara didn't know how to answer. The days that followed were the hardest she had ever faced. Harder even than the winters of hunger in the Green Valley Hills, because at least there she had her brothers to hug, her grandmother to comfort her, a sense of purpose that kept her going. Here she had only the silence and Morgana. The beta favorite seized every opportunity to humiliate her. During banquets, she made sure to sit close to Kyle, touching him with a familiarity that made Clara's blood boil. In the corridors, she would accidentally run into her and deliver venomous comments disguised as concern. "You look so pale, Your Majesty." she said one morning, intercepting Clara on her way to the gardens. "Perhaps you should rest more. After all, there's no need to exert yourself so much, is there? It's not as if you have royal wife duties to fulfill." The maids accompanying Clara exchanged uncomfortable glances, but none dared to defend their lady. Morgana was too powerful, too well connected, and the new queen everyone knew was just an unmarked foreigner. Clara swallowed the retort she wanted to make and kept walking, her head held high, despite the dizziness that threatened to fell her. The situation reached a critical point during a council assembly 3 months after the wedding. Clara was seated beside Kyle, struggling to keep her eyes open as the councillors debated border issues. The fever had been particularly strong the night before, and she felt as if her bones were made of lead. It was then that Morgana rose, asking permission to speak. Kyle nodded curtly, clearly impatient to end the meeting. He hadn't slept well either, Clara knew. She heard him tossing and turning in bed every night, feeling through the partial bond, the torment he tried to hide. Morgana stepped forward, her green eyes shining with thinly veiled satisfaction. "Your Majesty," she said, inclining her head in a bow that was more mockery than respect, "the Council and the Pack have concerns, serious concerns about the Queen's ability to fulfill her duties." The silence that followed was absolute. Clara felt all eyes turn to her, a physical pressure that made her want to shrink. "She doesn't bear your mark," Morgana continued, her voice growing in confidence. "She is visibly ill, and in 3 months of union there are no signs of an heir." She paused dramatically, letting the words sink in. "Perhaps it is time to consider alternatives." Clara felt the world spin around her. Blood drained from her face as the stares of everyone present fixed on her, judging, condemning. She saw in the eyes of some councillors a veiled agreement, the acceptance that Morgana was merely voicing what everyone thought. And then Kyle moved. He rose from the throne with a controlled violence that made the air in the room heavy. His eyes had changed, the ember transforming into liquid gold that burned with primordial fury. The wolf within him was at the surface, barely contained by his human skin. "Lady Morgana," he said, and his voice was a growl that made everyone present shrink in their seats. "Are you suggesting I should discard my wife like faulty merchandise?" Morgana paled, but maintained her posture. She had gone too far to retreat now. "I am suggesting the Pack deserves a complete Luna, Your Majesty. One who can give our lineage strong heirs, one who can—" "Silence!" Kyle's roar shook the walls. Clara saw the nearest councillors involuntarily bow, their inner wolves submitting to the Alpha's absolute authority. Even Morgana recoiled a step, her face now white as paper. "You are banished from this hall," Kyle said, each word sharp as a blade. "If I hear another word against my wife from your venomous mouth, you will be banished from the entire kingdom. And if you think of challenging my authority again, remember that I have very creative ways of dealing with traitors." Morgana gave a rigid bow, her green eyes burning with humiliation and hatred as she withdrew. The hall door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the silent chamber. For a long moment no one moved or spoke. Then Kyle turned to Clara, and she saw the mask of coolness crack for a moment to reveal the torment beneath. He had defended her honor, yes, but both knew Morgana's words held truth. She was an incomplete Luna, and she was dying because of it. That night, after the servants had retired and the candles were extinguished, Clara lay awake in the darkness, listening to Kyle's breathing from the other side of the bed. She knew he wasn't sleeping either. She could feel the tension in his body, the agitation of his inner wolf. "Why did you defend me?" she asked finally, her voice breaking the silence like a stone in a still lake. He took so long to reply that she thought he wouldn't. "Because you are my wife," he said finally. "But not your mate," she retorted, the words coming out more bitter than she intended. Not really. You made that clear yourself. The silence that followed was laden with something she couldn't identify. Pain, anger, regret. Clara. His voice was different now, softer, more vulnerable. You don't understand what you're asking of me. Then explain it to me. She sat up in bed, ignoring the dizziness. I'm tired of half-truths and silences, Cale. I'm dying. You know that as well as I do. The healers can't find what's wrong, because what's wrong isn't physical. It's the bond. It's the mark you refuse to give me. She could see him in the darkness, a silhouette against the faint light coming through the window. He was sitting up now too, his shoulders tense. If there's a reason why you'd rather see me wither than complete our union, I deserve to know what it is. And then, for the first time since she had known him, Kyle began to speak. My mother's name was Isolde, he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear. She was an Omega from the southern lands, fated to my father from the moment their eyes met. They say their love was legendary, the kind of love that inspires songs and poems. He paused, running a hand over his face. When I was 8, my mother began to waste away, just as you are wasting away now. The fevers, the weakness, the healers didn't know what to do. What was it? Clara asked, though a part of her already suspected the answer. The mark. The word came out like a bitter sigh. There is a curse in my lineage, Clara. When the mark is given in true love, it drains the mate's vitality, transferring her life force to the alpha. Clara felt her blood run cold in her veins. I watched my mother die like that, Kyle continued, and there was a pain so raw in his voice that she could almost touch it. Slowly, over months, as my father grew increasingly powerful, and she grew increasingly weak. When she finally died, he had enough power to conquer a continent, but he went mad with guilt and killed himself 3 years later. Tears streamed down Clara's face, but she didn't care. You knew, she said. From the moment you saw me, you knew we were fated, and you agreed to marry me anyway. I thought it could work, he said, his voice breaking. I thought if I kept my distance, if I never let the bond deepen too much. But I was wrong. You're dying anyway, and if I give in, I die. Faster, she completed. Kyle nodded in the darkness. I was trying to save you, but all I did was condemn you to a slower death. Clara was silent for a long moment. The anger she had felt for months was dissolving, replaced by something more complex. She looked at Kyle and saw not the cold king, but a tormented man, desperately trying to protect the woman he had managed to love since his mother's death. You love me, she said, not as a question. Kyle closed his eyes. From the moment you entered that hall. Clara moved in the bed, approaching him for the first time. She touched his face with trembling hands. Then let's find another way, she said, together. For the first time, she saw something that looked like hope in his eyes. That night, they slept side by side, their fingers intertwined over the space that had once separated them. It was a beginning. The following weeks brought a subtle but noticeable change in the dynamic between Kyle and Clara. They still didn't touch beyond what was necessary, still kept a certain distance during the day, but at night, in the privacy of the royal chambers, something had changed. They talked late, sharing stories of their vastly different childhoods, discovering common ground where they least expected it. Kyle told her about the lonely years after his mother's death, about the weight of growing up in the shadow of a father driven mad by grief. He told her about the nights he woke screaming, haunted by nightmares in which he saw his mother waste away before his eyes, unable to do anything to save her. He told her about the day he found his father's body at the base of the North Tower, and about the emptiness that settled in his chest and never left. Clara shared memories of her village, of playing with her brothers in the green fields when there was still food to eat. She told of her mother, who died giving birth to her youngest brother, and of her father, who never recovered from the loss and let himself waste away to death 2 years later. She told of her grandmother, Evelyn, the strong woman who had raised 4 children alone, and of the hunger that had pursued them through so many winters, and together they researched. The Citadel's library was vast, a labyrinth of shelves that rose to the vaulted ceiling, filled with ancient tomes and yellowed scrolls. Stained glass windows cast colored light onto the reading tables, creating patterns that moved as the hours passed. The smell of old paper and ink was strangely comforting, as if the knowledge accumulated over centuries could offer some protection against fate. Clara spent hours there, poring over texts in languages she barely understood, searching for any mention of the curse that separated them. Kyle joined her when his royal duties allowed, and sometimes she found him already waiting, surrounded by books, his eyes tired but determined. The priestess Celeste became an unlikely ally. She appeared silently beside Clara in the library, pointing out forgotten books in dusty corners, translating obscure passages, offering fragments of knowledge accumulated over decades of service to the moon and ancient spirits. "The curse you describe," she said one afternoon as the sun set beyond the dusty windows, "is not uncommon in the older Alpha lineages. It is the price of power, some say, the cost of carrying the blood of the first wolves. But there must be a way to break it," Clara insisted, frustration evident in her voice. She had already read dozens of texts, consulted hundreds of pages, and found nothing but vague references and incomplete legends. "Every curse has a counterpart, doesn't it? A way to be undone?" Celeste studied her with those milky eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface of things. "You are asking the wrong question," she said softly. "You ask how to break the curse. Perhaps you should ask what feeds it." Clara frowned. "What do you mean?" "The Alpha's power grows at the expense of the mate," the elder explained, her wrinkled fingers tracing invisible patterns on the table. "But have you ever wondered why? What makes the life force flow in only one direction? Why does the mate give and never receive?" That question haunted Clara for the following days. She turned it over in her mind as she walked through the Citadel's corridors, as she pretended to pay attention in audiences beside Kale, as she lay awake on cold nights, trying to make sense of the chaos. What fed the curse? Why did the force flow in only one direction? The Blood Moon Festival approached, an ancestral celebration that happened once a year when the full moon took on a reddish hue that the ancients believed to be the blood of the first wolves coloring the sky. It was a time of ritual hunts, of bonfires in the hills, of primal instincts running wild. It was also the time when wolves were most vulnerable to their natures, when control was hardest to maintain. "You shouldn't participate," Kyle said on the eve of the festival as they watched the preparations from the royal balcony. Below them, servants scurried back and forth, setting up tents, stacking firewood for bonfires, preparing the animals that would be hunted. "Your body is still weak, and, during the blood moon, instincts become difficult to control." Clara knew what he meant. She could already feel the agitation in her own blood, her inner wolf awakening from its sickly stupor, responding to the call of the approaching moon. It was like an itch beneath her skin, a need that went beyond the physical, something ancient and impossible to ignore. If it was like that for her, she imagined what it must be like for Kyle, whose power as Alpha amplified every sensation, every impulse. "I'm going," she said firmly. "I won't hide while my pack celebrates. I am their Luna, even without the mark. I need to be present." Kyle looked at her for a long moment, something indescribable in his golden eyes. "Aren't you afraid?" he asked softly. "Of being near me when the moon is at its peak? Of testing the limits of my control?" Clara turned to face him squarely. "I'm afraid of many things, Kyle. Afraid of dying before meeting my nieces and nephews. Afraid of never seeing the Green Valley Hills again. Afraid that this curse will win in the end. She took a step toward him, closing the distance he tried so hard to maintain. But I've never been afraid of you. His breath hitched almost imperceptibly. You should be, he whispered. I am a monster, Clara. A monster with a curse in his blood that kills what he loves. You are my husband, she corrected him, and monsters don't spend 15 years alone trying to find a cure for a curse that benefits them. Monsters don't refuse absolute power to protect a woman they barely know. Kyle closed his eyes, his jaw tense. You make it sound so simple. It's not simple, she admitted, but it's true. The Blood Moon Festival began at dusk, with the entire pack gathering in the clearings around the citadel. Bonfires were lit at strategic points, their orange flames dancing against the darkening sky. The air was charged with expectation, with primal energy that made the skin tingle. Clara walked beside Kyle at the beginning of the celebration, receiving the pack's bows. She noticed the stares, some curious, others still hostile, but maintained her upright posture. Let them think what they wanted. The ceremonial hunt began at midnight, when the moon finally emerged from behind the clouds, enormous and reddish, like a wound in the sky. The youngest wolves set off first, their howls echoing through the hills as they pursued the ritual prey. Then came the warriors, the experienced hunters. Kyle was supposed to lead the last, most important hunt, but as he prepared to leave, a storm appeared out of nowhere, black clouds swallowing the red moon. Amidst the chaos, Clara lost sight of Kyle. The rain came with a violence that caught her by surprise, soaking her clothes in seconds. She tried to run back to the citadel, but the darkness was absolute. A hand grabbed her arm. Come, Kyle said, pulling her toward a rock formation. There's a cave there. The cave was small, but offered protection from the storm. Clara huddled against the wall, shivering with cold. You're freezing, Kyle said, his voice tense. I'm fine, she lied. He looked at her for a moment. Then, with a sigh, he moved closer. Come here, he said, and opened his arms. Clara threw herself against his chest, absorbing his warmth. His scent enveloped her, more intense than ever, and she felt her inner wolf fully awaken. Kyle buried his face in her hair, breathing deeply. This is dangerous, he whispered. The moon, the storm, you so close. My control is hanging by a thread. Clara raised her face to look at him. His eyes had changed, the amber giving way to liquid gold. Then don't control yourself, she heard herself say. His eyes fixed on her lips, then moved down to her neck. If I give in now, if my teeth touch your skin. The priestess asked me a question, Clara said. She asked what feeds the curse, and I finally understood, Kyle. The curse feeds on fear. Your father was afraid of losing your mother, so he clung to her so tightly that he suffocated her. You're afraid of losing me, so you keep me at a distance. Kyle's eyes widened. Power always flows from those who fear to those who inspire fear, she continued. But what if there's no fear? What if, instead of you taking from me, we share with each other? You can't know if it will work. No, she admitted, but I know I'll die if we continue like this, and I'd rather risk dying trying than slowly wasting away. Kyle kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, hungry, years of containment exploding. Clara responded with equal fervor, clinging to him, and when his teeth brushed her neck, she didn't feel fear. She felt hope. Kyle's teeth didn't pierce Clara's skin that night in the cave. At the last moment, when she could already feel their pressure against her flesh, when her entire body vibrated with anticipation, he pulled away. His breathing heavy, his eyes still shining liquid gold, he fought to regain control. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the cave, a charged silence had settled. "Not like this," he said, his voice hoarse, as if the words were torn from him by force. "Not in a dark cave, in the middle of a storm, with you shivering with cold. If we're going to do this, if we're going to risk everything, it needs to be a conscious choice, not an impulse dictated by the moon." Clara wanted to protest. Every cell of her body screamed for the consummation of that moment, for the bite that would finally unite or destroy them. But a part of her, the part that could still think rationally through the haze of desire and fear, understood what he meant. The mark wasn't just a physical act, it was a sacred ritual, a fusion of souls that the ancients had established at the beginning of time. It deserved more than a cold cave and a decision made in the heat of the moment, when neither of them was completely in control of their faculties. They spent the rest of the night embraced, waiting for the storm to pass. Clara's body slowly warmed against his, and for the first time in months she felt something that resembled peace. It wasn't the completeness the mark would bring, but it was more than she had had before. It was connection, it was intimacy, it was a beginning. When dawn finally painted the sky pink and orange, they emerged from the cave to find the citadel in an uproar. The storm had caused considerable damage, felling ancient trees and damaging some of the outer structures. But there was something more in the air, a tension that had nothing to do with the weather. Guards ran through the corridors, messengers galloped in through the main road, and the faces of the councillors were etched with a concern that went beyond the storm's damage. "Your Majesty," General Thorne, commander of the Citadel's forces, intercepted Cale as soon as he crossed the gates. Thorne was a middle-aged man with a scar that cut his face from forehead to chin, a reminder of an ancient battle. His eyes, normally calm and calculating, now gleamed with urgency. "We received news overnight. The Northern Raiders are mobilizing." Clara felt her blood run cold in her veins. The Northern Raiders. The same ones who had devastated her pack, who had burned their crops and stolen their herds. The same ones who had forced her people to send her as a peace offering to the Alpha King. "How many?" Kyle asked, his posture changing instantly. The man who had held her so tenderly during the night disappeared, replaced by the warrior she knew him to be. "Thousands," Thorne replied, his voice grave. "Our spies report they've set up camp 2 weeks' march from here, but they're not just preparing to loot, Your Majesty. They're building siege engines, bringing provisions for months. This is a full-scale invasion." The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. Kyle barely slept, spending hours between meetings with his councillors and inspections of the Citadel's defences. He checked every wall, every gate, every weak point that could be exploited. He ordered the reinforcement of the ramparts, the storage of provisions, the intensive training of every wolf old enough to fight. Clara saw him only in glimpses, when he entered the chambers late at night to collapse into bed for a few hours of restless sleep. Sometimes she would wake and find him sitting on the edge of the bed, looking out the window into the darkness, his shoulders stooped under a weight she couldn't see but could feel through the partial bond connecting them. She tried to help where she could. She organized emergency supplies, cataloguing every sack of grain, every barrel of water, every bundle of medicinal herbs. She visited the healers to ensure they had everything they needed to treat the wounded. She coordinated the evacuation of families with young children to the mountain caves, where they would be protected if the worst happened. Her body was still weak, the fevers still tormented her, but she refused to stand idly by while her new home prepared for war. If she was going to die anyway, she preferred to die being useful than waste away in a bed. It was during one of these visits to the healers that she overheard the whispers that would change everything. She was in the corridor leading to the medicine wing, checking a list of herbs that needed to be collected before the siege, when female voices made her stop. "It's her fault," said a voice Clara recognized as belonging to one of Morgana's maids. The invaders learned of the king's weakness, an unmarked Luna, an incomplete bond. They realized it's the perfect time to attack. The Alpha is unstable, torn between protecting his wife and protecting his kingdom. Morgana says some of the northern leaders have contacted her, another voice replied, softer, as if fearing to be overheard. They say if she opens the gates when they arrive, they'll install her as Luna after it's all over. She would be queen of a much larger kingdom than this. Clara felt the floor open beneath her feet. Betrayal. Morgana was planning betrayal. She ran to find Cale, but the citadel was a labyrinth of corridors and stairs, and he could be anywhere. On the way, she crossed paths with Thorn, who looked at her with surprise and concern. "Your Majesty, you're pale as a ghost. Has something happened?" "The king," she gasped, her heart beating so hard she could barely hear her own voice. "Where is the king? I need to speak to him urgently." "On the north wall, inspecting the defenses. But—" Clara didn't wait for him to finish. She ran through corridors, climbed stairs, crossed courtyards, ignoring the curious stares of guards and servants, until she finally spotted Cale's figure at the top of the wall, bent over maps with his commanders. "Cale!" He turned, his tired face briefly lighting up at the sight of her before concern took over his features. "Clara, what's wrong? You should be resting. Your fever—" "Morgana," she said, still breathless, her hands on her knees as she tried to catch her breath. "She's planning to open the gates to the invaders. I heard her maids talking. She made a deal with the northern leaders." The silence that followed was absolute. The commanders exchanged shocked glances, but Kyle merely closed his eyes for a moment, as if absorbing a blow that on some level he had already expected. "I knew she was discontent," he said finally, his voice heavy with an exhaustion that went beyond the physical. "But I didn't think. Her ambition would lead her to betray her own people. We need to arrest her," Clara said, "before she can act." "Yes." Kyle turned to Thorn, who had followed them to the wall. "Find Lady Morgana, bring her to the throne room, and keep this discreet. We don't want panic among the people, not now." But it was already too late. The alarm horn sounded before Thorn could take 3 steps, a shrill sound that made Clara's blood run cold in her veins. From the top of the wall, she saw what everyone most feared. The Northern Army had arrived, weeks earlier than expected, emerging from the forest like a black tide of armor and enemy banners. Thousands of them, more than the spies had reported, advancing in battle formation. And the south gates, which should have been sealed and guarded, were slowly opening. "Morgana!" Kyle growled, his voice vibrating with a fury that made the hairs on the back of Clara's neck stand on end. Chaos erupted in seconds. Guards ran in all directions, trying to reach the gates before the enemy could enter. But the enemy vanguard was already advancing through the open gap, swords drawn, war howls echoing through the stone walls. The sound of metal on metal filled the air, cries of pain and fury mixing with the roar of combat. "You need to go to the North Tower," Kyle said, grabbing Clara by the shoulders with a force that almost hurt her. His eyes were wild, the gold burning with an intensity she had never seen. "There's a secret passage there that leads out of the citadel. If things go wrong, if I fall—" "I won't run," she interrupted, lifting her chin despite the fear that made her heart pound wildly. "I won't leave you. Clara, please." His voice broke, and for a moment she saw the man behind the king, the man terrified of losing the only person he had managed to love since his mother's death. "I said no." She held his face between her hands, exactly as she had in the cave. "We face this together. Isn't that what we promised?" Something broke in Cale's gaze, a barrier he had kept up since the first moment he saw her. He pulled her into an embrace so tight she could barely breathe, his lips brushing her temple. "Stubborn," he murmured against her hair. "My stubborn Luna." Then he released her, drew his sword, and descended into battle. Clara watched from atop the wall as her husband transformed into something she barely recognized. The Alpha King in combat was a force of nature, his sword cutting through the air with deadly precision, his roars paralyzing enemies before their blades could even touch him. He advanced through enemy lines like lightning through darkness, leaving a trail of fallen bodies. But something was wrong. She could see, even from a distance, that he was overexerting himself. Every blow consumed more energy than it should. Every roar left him a little weaker. The raw power he unleashed was burning him from the inside out, the curse. Without the mark to stabilize his power, without the complete connection to his fated mate, Kale's power was like a river without banks, overflowing uncontrollably. He was stronger than any other alpha on the continent, but that strength came at a cost he couldn't pay alone. And then she saw the blade. It was a dagger, small and almost invisible in the confusion of battle. The warrior wielding it had crept up behind Kyle, taking advantage of a moment when the king was surrounded by 3 enemies at once. Clara shouted a warning, but her voice was lost in the deafening noise of combat. The blade found its target. Kyle staggered, his hand instinctively going to his flank where the metal had pierced his armor. Even from a distance, Clara saw the color drain from his face, saw his knees buckle as he fell to the inner courtyard ground. Kyle! She didn't remember descending the wall. She didn't remember crossing the battlefield, dodging swords and fallen bodies. She only realized she was on her knees beside him, her hands pressing the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding, the fabric of her dress quickly becoming dark red. "Wolfsbane," said one of the healers who had approached, his face pale with horror. "The blade was poisoned with wolfsbane. Your Majesty, there's nothing we can do. The poison is already in his blood." "No," Clara whispered, denying the reality forming before her. "No, it can't be. There has to be something. A cure. An antidote." "Wolfsbane poison is fatal to our people," the healer said, his voice trembling. "There is no known cure. I am so sorry." Around her, Clara noticed the battle had paused. The entire pack was paralyzed, feeling through the collective bond that their alpha was falling. Panic began to spread like fire through dry straw, wolves dispersing, the defensive line crumbling before her eyes. And in the midst of the chaos, Morgana emerged beside the invaders, a triumphant smile on her perfect face. "The reign of the broken alpha has ended," she proclaimed, her voice echoing through the courtyard like thunder. "The citadel is ours." Clara looked at Kyle, at the pale face of the man she loved, at the golden eyes that struggled to stay open. He raised a trembling hand and touched her face, his fingers leaving traces of blood on her cheek. "Go," he whispered, each word a monumental effort against the poison that paralyzed his body. "Please, live." But Clara wasn't going anywhere. She had one last card to play. Clara slowly rose, positioning herself between Kale's body and the advancing invaders. Her legs trembled, her body still weak from weeks of fevers, but something was changing within her. Something ancient, powerful, that had nothing to do with physical strength. It was as if a flame that had been dormant in her chest finally began to burn. "The Luna," someone whispered in the crowd of paralyzed wolves. "The Queen is standing." Morgana laughed, a sharp, cruel sound that echoed through the blood-stained courtyard. She walked through the lines of invaders as if she owned everything, her red hair gleaming in the torchlight that still burned on the ramparts. "The untouched queen," she scoffed, her voice laden with contempt and satisfaction. "The false Luna who doesn't even bear her mate's mark. What do you think you're going to do, girl? Die beside him like the romantic fool you are? Cry over his body while I take the throne that always should have been mine?" Clara didn't reply immediately. Her eyes swept over the scene with a clarity that surprised her. The fallen soldiers, some of whom she had known in recent months, men and women who had sworn loyalty to their king. The pack wolves, paralyzed by fear and uncertainty, their inner wolves whimpering at the imminent loss of their alpha. The invaders who hesitated before that fragile figure who dared to stand in their way, as if sensing something they couldn't name. And Kyle, her Kyle, breathing slower and slower on the ground behind her, the poison working relentlessly in his blood. She thought of the priestess Celeste and her cryptic words about the curse. She thought of all the nights she had spent in the library, searching for answers that seemed not to exist. She thought of the question the elder had asked, what feeds the curse? And then she understood. Not just intellectually as she had understood in the cave, but on a deeper level. In her blood, in her bones, in every fiber of her being. The curse didn't feed only on fear. It fed on the dynamic of power, on the ruthless hierarchy that placed the alpha at the top and his mate in a position of submission. Previous alphas had taken from their mates, draining their life force, because that's what alphas did. They took, they dominated, they possessed, and their mates had allowed it, had yielded, had offered their lives in sacrifice to the love they felt. But Clara wasn't like the others. She hadn't been raised in court, surrounded by rules and expectations. She had grown up in a pack of starving wolves, where survival depended on cooperation, where each member contributed equally or all perished together. She had learned early on that true power didn't come from taking, but from sharing. What if she inverted the equation? What if, instead of being passively marked, she demanded the mark as an act of partnership? What if, instead of donating her life force, she offered to share it? Clara knelt beside Kyle, ignoring Morgana's shouts, ordering the soldiers to capture her, ignoring the hesitant advance of the invaders. With hands that no longer trembled, she held his face, forcing his clouded eyes to meet hers. "Kyle," she said, her voice firm and clear despite the chaos around them. "Can you hear me?" A groan was the only response. The poison was working fast, black veins spreading from the wound like the roots of a malignant tree, climbing his torso toward his heart. "You once told me you'd rather see me suffer from the lack of the bond than see me die in your arms," she continued, leaning closer until her lips almost touched his. "But you never asked me what I preferred. You never gave me the choice." His eyes focused for a moment, a spark of consciousness piercing the fog of poison. She saw recognition there, fear, love. "Clara, no, I'd rather risk it," she said, the words coming out with a conviction she didn't even know she possessed, a strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself. "I'd rather have one moment as your true mate than a lifetime as your stranger. The condition is over, Kyle. I no longer accept half measures. I no longer accept fear." She exposed her neck, tilting her head to the side in a gesture that was simultaneously submission and invitation. But there was something different in her posture, something that wasn't weakness. It was choice. It was power offered, not taken. It was partnership, not domination. "Mark me," she commanded, and her voice carried an authority that made even the invaders hesitate in their advance. "Not because you want to possess me, but because I choose to be yours. Not to drain my life, but to share yours. We will split this burden, Kyle. The power, the love, the destiny, everything together." "No!" Morgana lunged forward, her face contorted with fury. "Kill her! Kill them both now!" But none of the soldiers moved. Something was happening there, something they could feel even without understanding. The energy in the air had changed, becoming denser, more charged. It was like the moments before lightning strikes the ground, when the very air seems to vibrate with anticipation. Kyle's eyes widened, a visible struggle happening behind them. The man against the beast, reason against instinct, fear against love. She could feel his conflict through the partial bond, fragmented thoughts flashing through the connection like lightning. "I can't. I'll kill her. I love her too much. She'll die. I can't lose you," he murmured, each word a Herculean effort against the poison that paralyzed his body, that darkened his vision, that dragged him toward death. "Then, don't lose me," she said simply. "Accept me. Choose me as I am choosing you." For a moment that seemed to last an eternity, nothing happened. Clara closed her eyes, focusing all her will, all her strength, on the invisible bond that connected them. She visualized not a drainage, not a taking of power, but a flow, two currents meeting, mixing, strengthening each other, like two rivers joining to form one, more powerful than either of them alone. She felt the wolf inside her fully awaken for the first time, no longer weak and sick, but alive, vibrant, hungry. It rose within her like a moon rising on the horizon, and she directed it toward the bond, toward Kyle, toward the connection that united them. And then, guided by the primordial instinct of survival and possession, Kyle moved. His teeth pierced Clara's skin at the junction of her shoulder and neck. The world seemed to stop. There was no drainage of life. There was no horrible suction that the ancient texts described, the sensation of having one's essence ripped out drop by drop. Instead, there was an explosion. Golden and silver light erupted from the point where Kale's teeth pierced. Clara's skin, a wave of energy so powerful that it was visible to the naked eye. It spread like ripples in a lake, knocking down the nearest invaders, making the pack wolves howl in unison. The mark burned where the teeth pierced, but it was a warmth that radiated power, not weakness. Clara felt something flow between them, pure energy circulating like blood in shared veins, from him to her, from her to him, in an infinite cycle that had no beginning or end. The wolfsbane poison receded before that force, the black veins shrinking, disappearing like shadows before the sun. The wound on Kale's flank began to close, the flesh regenerating at impossible speed. Color returned to his face, strength to his limbs. And Clara felt the weakness that had haunted her for months simply evaporate. The fevers, the fatigue, the constant feeling that something essential was missing. All of it vanished, replaced by a vitality she had never experienced. It was as if she had spent her entire life breathing thin air and suddenly discovered what it meant to truly breathe. The psychic shockwaves spread beyond the courtyard, reaching every wolf in the pack, every member of the band who had sworn allegiance to Kyle. It strengthened them, awakened their inner wolves, reminded them of who they were and to whom they belonged. The curse was broken, not by avoidance, as Kyle had tried for 15 years, not by sacrifice as previous mates had done, but by mutual and fearless acceptance of risk, by true partnership, by love that knew no fear. Kyle slowly rose, Clara rising beside him. Their hands met, fingers intertwined, and she could feel the connection between them like a rope of light uniting them. She knew what he was thinking, feeling, wanting. And he knew the same about her. There were no more secrets, no more barriers. They were two bodies, but one soul. Morgana recoiled, her eyes wide with shock and pure terror. "Impossible," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The curse... You should be dead. The ancient texts, the legends, no mate ever survived." Clara turned to face her. Her own eyes now shone, not in alpha gold, but in liquid silver, the color of the full moon, the color of the Luna. "No mate was ever treated as a partner," she said, her voice echoing through the courtyard in a way that wasn't entirely natural. "No mate ever demanded equality instead of accepting submission. The curse fed on fear and hierarchy, Morgana, on the imbalance of power between Alpha and Omega. But I am not a traditional Omega, and Kyle is not a traditional Alpha. Together we are something new." The roar Kyle let out made the very stones of the citadel tremble. It was a sound of pure power, of absolute authority, amplified by the newly formed bond. The invaders fell to their knees, their inner wolves instinctively submitting to the supremacy of the Alpha who had conquered death. "The battle is over," Kyle said, and his voice carried an authority that brooked no questioning. "Surrender now, and you will be treated with mercy. Resist and face the consequences." One by one, the enemy soldiers lowered their weapons. Morgana tried to flee, taking advantage of the confusion to slip toward the gates, but she didn't get far. The guards who had recovered intercepted her, dragging her back to the courtyard. "Please," she pleaded, all arrogance gone, replaced by pathetic fear. "I was desperate. The king never truly wanted me. I deserved. You wanted power." Clara interrupted, her voice devoid of anger or resentment, only an ancient sadness. "Power that wasn't yours to take. And because of that ambition, people died today. People who had families, dreams, entire lives ahead of them." "You are banished," Kyle said, his golden eyes unforgiving. "From the Eastern Reach and any allied kingdom. If you are seen again within our borders, the sentence will be death." The guards dragged her away, her protests echoing through the corridors until silence finally settled over the bloodied courtyard. Clara looked around, at the fallen bodies, at the pack gathered in groups still trembling. From the intensity of what they had witnessed, at the defeated invaders being escorted to the dungeons. There was much work to be done, many wounds to heal, many losses to mourn. But for now, at that moment, all she could feel was Cale's hand in hers, and the mark on her neck pulsing with an energy that promised a future she barely dared to imagine. The curse was broken, and they were just beginning. Weeks passed since the battle that had changed everything. The citadel rose again, stronger than before. The damage caused by the invasion had been repaired, with an efficiency that surprised even the most experienced master builders. The ramparts were reinforced, the gates rebuilt with stronger metal, the defenses expanded to ensure no traitor could ever open them from within again. But the most significant change wasn't in the stone and iron structures. It was in the air, in the energy that pulsed through every corridor, in every glance exchanged between pack members. There was a new vitality, a hope that seemed to radiate from the very walls of the castle. They had a true Luna now, a marked, recognized, complete Luna. Clara walked through the inner gardens in the golden light of late afternoon, the sun warming her skin in a way she had never experienced before the mark. Her body, which for so many months had withered under the weight of the incomplete bond, now radiated a vitality that surprised even the most experienced healers. The shadows beneath her eyes had completely disappeared. The fevers were a distant memory that seemed to belong to another person in another life. She touched the mark on her neck, a gesture that had become a comforting habit over the weeks. The scar was still sensitive to the touch, pulsing gently in response to her thoughts about Cale. Through the bond, she could feel him somewhere in the castle, probably locked in yet another meeting with the councillors, dealing with the diplomatic consequences of the foiled invasion. She smiled to herself. Even from a distance, she knew exactly how he was feeling. Bored with the protocol formalities, impatient to finish, thinking of her with an intensity that made her blush even when she was alone. "Your Majesty?" Clara turned to find one of the young maids approaching with hesitant steps. She was a new girl who had been promoted to the royal wing only after the battle. Her name was Lyra, and she looked at the Queen with a mixture of respect and admiration that still made Clara uncomfortable. "Letters from the Green Valley Hills, Your Majesty. Your brothers wrote again." Clara's heart warmed as she took the scrolls. Her brother's letters had become a treasure she carefully kept in a special box beside her bed. Each one was a window into the life she had left behind, a life that, thanks to her sacrifice, now prospered in ways she had never dreamed possible. She sat on a stone bench under an ancient tree whose leaves were already beginning to change color with the approach of autumn, and unrolled the first letter. The messy handwriting of her eldest brother, Luke, made her smile despite the tears that threatened to form. "Dear Clara," the letter read, "you won't believe how big the crops got this year. The wheat is so tall the boys get lost playing in the fields, and we had to hire extra help for the harvest because there just aren't enough hands in the pack to gather everything. Grandma Evelyn is much better. The remedies you sent worked miracles. She even managed to walk to the market last week for the first time in 3 years. When she came back, she was so excited telling about all the people she met that we almost forgot she was sick. Tommy asks about you every day. He keeps that doll you made for him under his pillow before you left. Pete wants to be a warrior when he grows up, like the soldiers who came to escort the provisions. I try to explain that he needs to learn to read first, but you know, Pete, we miss you every day, but we know you're where you need to be. The whole pack prays for you and the king every night. You saved us all, Clara. Never forget that. With love, Luke, Pete, Tommy, and Grandma Evelyn." Tears streamed down Clara's face, but they were tears of pure joy, the kind she had forgotten existed. Her sacrifice had been worth it, not just worth it, it had multiplied into blessings she had never expected to receive. Her people were well, her family was healthy, and she had found something she never thought possible. She had found a home. Cale's presence alerted her even before she saw him. The bond pulsed with his proximity, a wave of warmth and contentment that made her instinctively turn toward him, a smile already forming on her lips. He came down the stone path between the flower beds, still wearing the formal clothes from the council meetings, but his collar was unbuttoned and his hair slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it several times in frustration. There was a glint in his eyes that suggested he had escaped earlier than expected. "Running from your responsibilities, Your Majesty," she teased when he got close enough to hear. "Delegating," he corrected with a half-smile, sitting beside her on the stone bench. His weight made the wood creak slightly. "Thorne can very well listen to the ambassadors complain for another hour about war reparations. I had more important matters to attend to. More important matters in the garden." Kyle pulled her closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulders with a naturalness that still surprised her sometimes. For so long he had kept his distance, built walls between them. Now it seemed he couldn't stay away from her for more than a few hours, before inventing an excuse to find her. "Matters involving my wife," he said, his lips brushing her temple in a way that sent pleasant shivers throughout Clara's body. "My Luna, my mate." She snuggled against him, absorbing the warmth of his body, and the familiar scent of sandalwood and spices that was now intertwined with her own aroma. "You're crying," he observed, noticing the damp traces on her cheeks. "Did the letters bring bad news?" "Good news," she corrected, showing him the scrolls she still held. "My family is well, more than well, and it's thanks to you." "It's thanks to us," he said softly, kissing the top of her head. "None of what was done would have been possible without you, Clara. You were the true savior, not I." They were silent for a moment, enjoying the peace that had become so precious after so many weeks of chaos, battle, and rebuilding. The sound of the wind in the leaves, the distant birdsong, each other's breathing. It was simple, it was ordinary, and it was absolutely perfect. "The priestess Celeste came to see me this morning," Cale eventually said, breaking the comfortable silence that had settled between them. Clara raised her head to look at him, curious. Celeste rarely left her quarters in the East Tower, where she spent her days meditating and consulting the spirits. "What did she want?" "To talk about the curse, or rather about how it was broken. He paused, his eyes lost in some distant point, as if he was seeing something beyond the garden, beyond the present. She said that what happened in that courtyard wasn't just a choice of yours or mine. It was a redefinition of something much larger, a correction of an imbalance that had existed for generations. Clara felt her heart race. What exactly does that mean? She believes the curse of my lineage is permanently undone, he said, turning to face her. Not just for us, but for all who come after. Our children and our children's children will no longer carry this death sentence. They will be able to love freely, mark their mates without fear. Clara felt the tears return, but now they were tears of such profound joy that she could barely contain them. 15 years Kyle had carried the weight of that curse alone. 15 years, believing he could never have what every wolf desired, a true mate, a family, a love without shadows. So it's over, she whispered. Truly. Forever. Forever. Kyle held her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away the tears. You saved more than our lives that day, Clara. You saved future generations not even born yet. The priestess thinks you may have been the first Omega in centuries to truly understand what it means to be a Luna. And what does it mean, according to her? Not just to be the Alpha's mate, he said, his golden eyes shining with an emotion that made Clara's heart clench. But to be his equal, his partner in everything, not just in name. The moon doesn't exist to passively reflect the sun's light, Clara. It has its own strength, its own power, its own magic. It moves tides, guides lost travelers, illuminates the darkness when the sun cannot. It is the balance of the sky. Clara smiled, touched by the analogy and by what it revealed about the man she loved. The Alpha King feared across the continent, speaking of moons and balance as if he were a poet. You're getting poetic in your old age, she teased gently. It's entirely your fault, he replied, and there was a genuine smile in his voice, something still rare enough to be precious. You turned me into a man who reads poems and skips important meetings to be in the garden with his wife. What a terrible scandal! The worst kind. They laughed together, and the sound echoed through the garden, light and free in a way that seemed impossible just a few months ago, when every day was a battle against pain, fear, and loneliness. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple, Cale guided her back into the castle. They walked hand in hand through the corridors, nodding to the guards and servants who bowed in deference that was now genuine instead of merely obligatory. In the throne room, where it had all begun so many months ago, Clara paused for a moment. The scent of sandalwood and cold rain that had greeted her on that terrifying first day had changed. Now, it was a mixture of warm spices and wildflowers. The intertwined aroma of the two of them, united, inseparable. It was the smell of a home. 2 thrones stood side by side atop the stone steps, equal in size and importance. The second had been added the previous week, commissioned to be carved from the same black stone as the original throne, a public declaration that the Luna was not a decorative figure, but a ruler in her own right. "What are you remembering?" Kyle asked, stopping beside her and following her gaze to the thrones. "The day I arrived," she replied. "The fear I felt, so strong I could barely breathe. The certainty that I was selling my soul to save my people, how cold and distant and terrifying you seemed. And now? What do you feel now?" Clara turned to face him, raising her hand to touch the scar that marked his eyebrow, that reminder of past battles she had learned to love. "Now I know I didn't sell anything," she said, her voice firm and clear. "I made a trade, my old life for a new one, my fears for courage, my loneliness for you, and it was the best trade I could have made." Cale held her hand, pressing his lips against her palm in a gesture of reverence that made her feel like the most important woman in the world. "Was it worth it?" he asked, and despite the light tone, she knew the question was serious. He still carried guilt for the suffering she had endured, for the months of fevers and venomous whispers and lonely nights in a bed too large. Every moment, she said, and it was the purest truth she had ever spoken, every tear, every sleepless night, every second of doubt and pain. I would do it all again, Kyle, 1,000 times if I had to, 1,000,000 times. His eyes gleamed, not in alpha gold, but with something far more human and far more precious. Pure emotion, love in its most vulnerable and strongest form. "My Luna," he whispered. "My Alpha," she replied. And when he kissed her, there in the throne room where it had all begun, Clara knew with absolute certainty that she was finally home. They would rule together, not as king and subject, but as equal partners. They would face challenges, raise children, grow old side by side. The curse was broken, fear had been conquered, and the future stretched before them like a moonlit path, full of possibilities she barely dared to imagine. A cruel condition had united them at first, but it was love, true and fearless love, that would keep them together forever. The scent of sandalwood and wildflowers filled the hall as the moon began to rise in the sky outside, silver and perfect. And somewhere in the Green Valley Hills, 3 boys looked at that same moon and thought of their sister, the poor girl who had become queen, the Omega who had tamed the most feared Alpha on the continent, not with force, not with submission, but with love.